In chapter 13, Jesus calls all to repentance. In the midst of this call, Luke records a unique teaching of Jesus. Jesus goes against popular thought and says that people who had been killed tragically were not being punished by God for sin. They were no more guilty than anybody else. This includes the people Pilate had recently killed and used as sacrifice material, as well as the 18 people who had recently died when a tower collapsed on them. Jesus then points out to the people that since they have such an interest in death and punishment for sins, they ought to examine their own hearts to see if they are ready for death, and they shouldn't think poorly of other people who have died or have had bad things happen to them, because the people who had been tragically killed were no worse than anyone else. Jesus also tells a parable about a man who had a fig tree that never gave him any figs for 3 years. So he was going to cut it down, but his gardener intervened and convinced him to wait a year while he gave it special attention. Jesus is saying that God isn't out to cut people down. He's like the patient gardener who works hard to bring out the good in people. In this passage, Luke records the healing of the crippled woman on the Sabbath. In both this story and the previous teaching, Luke appears to use Jewish symbolism. He uses the number 18 to describe both the number of people tragically killed, as well as the number of years this woman had been crippled by a spirit. The fact that her infirmity was caused by a spirit is significant. The number 18 is essentially the same as 6 and 6 and 6, indicating that her infirmity, as well as the tragic deaths of the others, were directly related to Satan. It is fitting, then, that Jesus heals the woman on the Sabbath, the 7th day. At this point, Jesus also reiterates the fact that the Pharisees have chosen to make certain rules, such as a strict interpretation of keeping the Sabbath, more important than the law of loving one's neighbor. Jesus then tells the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast. Jesus presses on towards Jerusalem, preaching and teaching as he goes. Someone asks him if only a few will be saved, and Jesus says to try hard to enter through the narrow door, because many will try to enter God's kingdom and fail. He says that when the door finally closes, it will be too late and people will be banging on the door, begging to be let in. Some Pharisees show up and tell Jesus to run and hide because Herod wants to kill him. But Jesus calls Herod a fox and says he will continue on, and he hints at his death and resurrection on the 3rd day in Jerusalem. Jesus then laments the role of Jerusalem as the one who killed the prophets of God. He uses feminine and animal imagery to describe himself as the one who wanted to safely gather up Jerusalem as a hen gathers up her chicks under her wings, but Jerusalem was unwilling. He predicts that sometime after his visit, Jerusalem will be destroyed, and that they will never see him again until they once again bless the one that God sends to them.